Culloden's battle is long over, but many still believe the moor is not at rest. Even now the ground is spoken of in whispers, with cries said to rise through the mist, footsteps heard where no one stands, and figures seen near the graves at dusk. Here the dead are not easily forgotten. The woods keep their shadows, and some say the moor still remembers. On the 16th of April 1746, on the bleak ground of Culloden Moor near Inverness, the Jacobite rising met its final and most devastating end in open battle. The armies that faced each other there were not meeting on unknown ground, but on a chosen stretch of exposed moor where every yard would soon carry consequence. What remains now appears quiet at first glance, yet Culloden has never been remembered as an ordinary battlefield, nor spoken of as a place entirely at rest. The Jacobite cause had advanced far into Britain under Charles Edward Stuart, carrying the hope that the Stuart line might be restored to the throne by force. Yet by spring of 1746, retreat, exhaustion, hunger, and failing momentum had reduced that earlier confidence, leaving the rising strained before the final confrontation arrived. Culloden was therefore not simply a battle still to be fought. It was the moment when months of loss and desperation closed in on ground later spoken of with dread. Opposing the Jacobites stood government forces under Prince William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, better supplied, more disciplined, and prepared to use the open moor to advantage. The ground itself favoured ordered firepower over sudden impact, which placed clear advantage with an army facing Highland assault in open formation. Even before the first full advance began, the shape of the field had already begun to fix something darker into the place, long before ghost stories were ever told of it. The battle opened with artillery, and government guns quickly established control, sending shot across the moor into ranks already unsettled by cold, fatigue, and delay. Under that pressure, the Jacobite line could not remain motionless forever, and eventually elements of it surged forward into fire across difficult, uneven ground. What followed was not a clean, heroic charge preserved in legend, but a compressed, violent collapse that left behind the kind of suffering people later believed could never fully settle. Within less than an hour, the Jacobite army had been broken, and the field was left with dead, wounded, and men trying desperately to escape the slaughter. The defeat at Culloden ended the final Jacobite rising, but it also left behind the kind of sudden and violent loss that people have long believed can stain a place. That is part of why Culloden is so often spoke of as haunted, because many believe the suffering left on the moor did not end when the fighting stopped. Before the battle began in full, the Jacobite army was already weakened by the failed night march towards Nairn, intended to surprise Cumberland's forces before dawn. The attempt achieved little beyond draining strength from men who returned hungry, tired, and disordered across the same bleak miles they had crossed in darkness. By the time they formed again on Culloden Moor, many were stepping into the final battle already exhausted, as though the moor itself had begun to wear them down. When the artillery exchange opened, government guns struck with greater consistency, while Jacobite fire proved less effective against a better positioned and steadier opposing line. Each minute spent under bombardment increased the pressure on men who could see the field offering them little cover and even less chance to recover formation. Culloden therefore became a place where waiting was itself destructive, and later generations would remember it not only for battle, but for the dread that seemed to cling to it. At last, sections of the Jacobite line drove forward, aiming to close the distance quickly and bring the fight to close quarters, where Highland assault had previously proved dangerous. But the charge did not move evenly across the moor, and broken ground, marshy patches, and disorder under fire disrupted the advance before it fully connected. Some men reached the government front and fought fiercely at close range, but elsewhere the line faltered, and the violence left behind the kind of memory people later felt still lingered. Government troops had prepared for exactly such an attack, using drilled musket fire and coordinated bayonet work designed to meet the Highland charge with brutal efficiency. What followed was not a long contest spread across the day, but a concentrated period of killing in which the Jacobite front rapidly began to collapse. Once gaps opened and momentum failed, the field turned from assault to destruction, and that sense of sudden rupture still shapes how Culloden is experienced now. After the line broke, the moor was left with bodies, wounded men, and shattered groups moving in confusion as the defeat spread beyond any chance of recovery. The dead were later gathered into mass graves associated with the clans, and the battlefield's memory became fixed, not only in history, but in marked and consecrated ground. From that point onward, Culloden was no longer only a battlefield, but ground where the dead were buried and, many would later say, never fully left behind. For many Jacobites, death did not come only in the charge itself, but in the confusion that followed as the broken army tried to flee the field. Men already wounded were left exposed on the moor, while others were pursued as organised resistance collapsed into scattered movement and desperate attempts to survive. That is why later ghost stories fit Culloden so easily, because the violence here did not end cleanly, and the dead were remembered as men caught in terror and unfinished suffering. Those carried from the worst of the fighting were taken where they could be sheltered, and local buildings became a place of pain, blood loss, and fading hope. Leenock Cottage survives within the landscape today, and its presence makes the battlefield closer, more human, and less safely sealed inside military history. A place like that does not feel separate from what happened around it. It feels as though it stood close enough to hold some trace of the suffering still. The dead were gathered into pits on the moor, and over time the battlefield became marked not by individual stories fully preserved, but by collective resting places. The clan markers that now stand across the burial ground give the field a different kind of silence, one shaped by identity, grief, and the weight of the unforgotten dead. Visitors do not cross the ground as though walking over ordinary open land, but as though they are passing through a place where memory and presence were left behind together. Beyond Culloden itself came a wider effort to crush what remained of Jacobite strength and weaken the structures that had supported Highland resistance. The repression that followed reached into dress, arms, authority, and everyday life, ensuring that the battle would be remembered as a breaking point, not merely a defeat. That wider aftermath deepened Culloden's haunting, because the moor came to stand not only for violent death, but for a wound many believed never truly closed. Places linked to sudden death often survive in memory through names, dates, and official records, but Culloden endured in a more physical and unsettling way than that. The moor remained open, the graves remained visible, and the story remained close enough for later generations to feel they were standing beside its consequences. By then, Culloden had become more than the scene of a battle. It had become a place where death, memory, and haunting seemed fixed into the same ground. In the years that followed, Culloden was not remembered only through military records and family loss, but through stories that something of the battle still remained. People spoke of hearing cries across the moor, of sensing movement where no living person stood, and of feeling watched among the graves. Those accounts describe more than remembrance alone. They suggest a place where the boundary between past suffering and present experience feels unusually thin. Among the most persistent reports are sounds said to resemble battle itself, with shouts, distress calls, and the metallic impression of conflict breaking through the quiet. Such experiences are often described as brief and uncertain, not as full scenes clearly witnessed, but as fragments that disturb the normal atmosphere of the field. That uncertainty makes the reports more unsettling, because what is heard never arrives plainly enough to settle into certainty or dismiss itself completely. Other visitors have described seeing figures on the moor, sometimes as solitary forms, sometimes as wounded men, and sometimes as soldiers who vanish when approached. One recurring tradition speaks of a Highland figure in tartan, drawn and distressed in appearance, as though the battle had not released him from it. Whether such sightings come from grief, suggestion, or something stranger, they remain tied to Culloden because the place already feels prepared to receive them. Particular unease is often attached to the burial area, where the clan markers and low ground beneath them make memory feel concentrated rather than evenly spread. Some reports describe a heaviness there, an abrupt change in mood, or the sense that ordinary sound falls away as people cross into that part of the field. It is easy to see why, because these are not symbolic memorials placed everywhere. They stand where the dead themselves were gathered. Culloden's haunting tradition also gathers around certain times and conditions, especially mist, fading light, and the anniversary of the battle in mid-April. On such occasions, stories tell of the moor feeling newly charged, as though memory presses closer to the surface and the past begins to overlap the present. The nearby woods and the darker edges of the field deepen that feeling, as though movement might still be passing just beyond clear sight. Culloden woods sit beside a battlefield already burdened by memory, and that edge between open moor and shadowed cover gives many reports their particular force. The trees suggest concealment, retreat, and unseen movement, all of which sit naturally beside a story shaped by pursuit, fear, and sudden death. In a place like that, the woods do not feel separate from the battle. They feel like one more place where its presence could have lingered. Many accounts from Culloden describe suggestion rather than spectacle, with brief impressions, half-heard sounds, and figures that never fully resolve. The haunting here is rarely told as a single dramatic encounter. It is more often described as an atmosphere pressing in until the ordinary feels disturbed. That form suits the place, because Culloden has always carried dread most strongly through silence, exposure, and the knowledge of what happened underfoot. Even without a full apparition or unmistakable sign, Culloden can leave visitors with the powerful sense that something in the landscape remains unsettled. The graves, the open moor, the surviving cottage, and the stillness of the surrounding ground combine to keep the battle close rather than safely distant. The reports endure because the setting itself remains difficult to shake, leaving visitors with the sense that the field keeps something back. Some battlefields become remote through time, absorbed into wider history until the details soften and the dead feel unreachable to those who arrive centuries later. Culloden resists that softening because its losses remain visibly gathered in the landscape, and its story still feels contained within a walkable stretch of ground. The haunting attached to Culloden does not feel added from outside. It feels as though it rose out of the ground itself and never fully withdrew. On the moor and in the woods beside it, no clear apparition is needed for unease to take hold. Culloden creates that feeling by its very nature. The battle ended there in 1746, but the sense of rupture did not, and generations have continued to feel that something of it remains close by. Perhaps that is the true ghost of Culloden Moor, not one figure amongst the trees, but a landscape that still seems unable to let the dead go.